And welcome back to part 2 of the Words of Wisdom interview with Stuart Maconie. Of all the characters you've written about in this book, and there are obviously, as you mentioned, 100, with whom would you most like to have a pint with down the pub, either dead or alive?
Oh, there's a few. Mal, who seems such a genial and lovely man. I mean, I have had a pint down the pub with Hunter Davies, but I would happily do that again because he's just such a fond of stories. You know, he is a great raconteur. When I think I mentioned it in the book, when I first went to Hunter's house, I know Hunter a little through our Cumbrian connections. We both spent time in Cumbria. We've hung out there in local pubs. We've both written a lot about Cumbria, and we were both columnists for the same magazines in Cumbria. But when I first went to his house in London, he answered the door to me. And as I say, one of the first things he did after offering me a goblet of wine at 10:30 in the morning was pointed to a picture of an old English sheepdog on the stairs and said, "What's the name of that dog, please?" And I said, "Martha." And he said, "Good, you've passed. In you come." You know, he's just got such a fond of stories, as well as having a filing cabinet with Paul McCartney's underpants in, you know. But Mal, I think, maybe Neil. That Neil, to use that popular phrase, knew where the bodies were buried, but said very little. And I think towards the end of his life, he didn't know it was towards the end of his life, but he began to start to open up a bit to Mark Lewis. And Mark Lewis has said that Neil had said to him, "I think I'm ready to tell the story now." And then he got ill and died. So we never know. And of course, who wouldn't? It wouldn't be a pint. I don't think Jane would drink pints, but yes. who wouldn't go for a glass of wine with Jane Asher?
Absolutely. She's not spoken a word of her relationship with Paul McCartney since they broke up. What a class act.
She's a class act, isn't she? And also, I mean, yeah, I don't want to come over as kind of creepy, but as Paul says in the time when they first meet at the Albert Hall back in, is it 64? Sorry, I feel like I've been so full of Beatles information for so long, and I feel like I've just kind of dumped it onto the page. But Paul says, like, "Oh, we all fancied her immediately," and of course they were. They were smitten by her immediately. You know? But yeah, she's her and Neil are the kind of only ones who've never really told their story, and Neil because he didn't get the chance. But she's a real class act, yeah. And vitally important, the Beatles story, because the Ashers, Jane and her family, are Paul's intellectual and artistic awakening. I mean, he was clearly a bright, talented lad, but suddenly there is university, there is Sorbonne, there is Oxford and Cambridge. He suddenly is introduced to the world of modern art and literature, and it fires him. I don't think it would have had the same effect on John. I think John would have kind of been resentful about it. But Paul just goes, tell me more about Samuel Beckett and Stockhausen and Bellini and things like that, you know.
Well, let's make an open invitation to Jane. If she's watching, we'd love to have a drink with her down the pub, Guinness, maybe a baby shower. Yes. We're throwing a packet of crisps, even maybe some pork scratchings, and we promise not to post it on any social media. Deal?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
There's plenty of the usual Stuart Maconie piercing wit in your book. My favourite is your musings on Cynthia Lennon and her almost shape-shifting attempts to appease John. I'll quote, if I may, "In the end, becoming an enigmatic Japanese avant-garde conceptual artist was an impossible transformation too far." I love that line.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true. I think you could see that she was always changing to what she thought John wanted. So she tries Preludin and hates it because they're doing that in Hamburg. She becomes a sort of Brigitte Bardot from Hoylake kind of girl. She's a prim, pretty schoolgirl who becomes like a femme fatale Brigitte Bardot type because that's John's type then. She becomes a kind of hippie and becomes Rishikeshi, you know, and meditates and all that. But in the end, she couldn't be all the things John wanted. And certainly when Yoko comes into his life, that's it, you know. Because in a way, I guess it's like Paul and Jane. Suddenly he thinks, oh, this is different art, challenging stuff, and he's fascinated to a degree, and that's for Cynthia in the end. There's a sadness there. And in one of the last interviews she ever did, it's not one of the last interviews she ever did actually. Sorry, it's one of the longest interviews she ever did on camera with Tony Wilson for Granada TV, the great Tony Wilson. And I just think there's such a poignancy that in the end he says, "What Beatles song means most to you and sums up your feelings about them?" And she says, "The Long and Winding Road," which of course is by Paul. It's a brilliantly ironic choice, you know.
You introduce in the book one of the all-time classic albums, not the White Album or Abbey Road, but K-Tel's 1972 20 dynamic hits, the forerunner to the current Now series. Can you explain how that fits into the Beatles story?
Yeah, because when I was a kid and I had that album, and we and my mates, I was probably 13, 12 or 13, and you know, as kids were then, obsessed with the pop charts, and you had these albums, and you would have ones, and you'd go, "Yeah, love that, hate that, skip that." And one of the ones I always skipped was "Oh Babe, What Would You Say" by Hurricane Smith, because I used to think, "What is this? It's kind of a bit of vaudeville stuff." "Oh babe, what would you say?" And of course, being a sort of 13-year-old boy, I didn't like it at all. But then I found out, oh, but you know, that weird band whose singles you like, Syd Barrett's Pink Floyd, he discovered and produced them. What? And then I realized he engineered the Beatles records. And I think that was such a shock to me that I knew Hurricane Smith as a mildly odd novelty pop act of the early 1970s, who had a #1 in America, amazingly. Then to find out he's instrumental in the careers of the Beatles and Pink Floyd, you know, is really remarkable. But there are lots of things like that, like in the story. Ivor Arbiter, who is the man who designs the Beatles logo off the cuff, spur of the moment, in a drum shop in London for £5, just says that we need a logo for the front of the drum riser, for the front of the drum, the bass drum. What about that? Yeah, that'll do. The one that's still the official Beatles logo with the drop T. 20 odd years later, due to a fluke series of chances on a business trip, he is the man who introduces karaoke to the West. It's really extraordinary. All these people who come into the Beatles story, you know, and have some kind of shaping influence on them, you know, and that, well, of course, that's why I decided to write the book.
And going back to that Norman Hurricane Smith song, "Don't Let It Die," that almost got on the Help album. I think they went for Act Naturally in the end, but he did push to get that song on the album. And for a while, they were considering it.
They were, you know, because it's an early sort of ecological song, isn't it? I think the lyric is vaguely, I think "Don't Let It Die," it's a sort of a love song, but I think it's also implying, you know, we must look after nature and things like that. And I think John quite liked it, and certainly he was. Who wouldn't push for one of those songs to be on a Beatles album? But they went for Act Naturally instead. I think I'd rather they'd gone for "Don't Let It Die." That would have been extraordinary.
It would have been, wouldn't it? And also on that album, that K-Tel compilation album, there's Colin Blunson's "Say You Don't Mind," which of course was written by Denny Laine. So another Beatles link on that album.
Yeah, absolutely. Denny, who co-wrote, of course, "Mull of Kintyre," which, yeah, you know, we tend to think of that as being a Paul song, but it's co-written with Denny Laine, yeah. Yeah, I mean, some people's brush with Beatledom was happy. And I like the fact that, as I say, like Alf Bicknell and Leslie Cavendish, their chauffeur and their barber, obviously to this day dine out on it. And they've written amusing, rather slight autobiographies with punning titles. And I think that's great. And quite often, the Beatles themselves would give them a funny forward for them, you know. And I like that. I like that, you know, that they would, they didn't sort of use people and discard them at all. They weren't like that. So, you know, once Alf Bicknell had left their employ, you know, when he decides he wants to write it, I think it's called "Drive My Car," isn't it? "Baby, You Can Drive My Car," his autobiography. And I think somebody contributed I think John contributed a funny intro to Bob Wooler's book. Oh, do you know, John contributed a funny, charming intro forward to Alan Williams's book. They remembered these people by and large, and they weren't beyond, you know, extending a hand of friendship.
Sadly, only 100 characters in your book. Any who missed the cut, which you simply didn't have room for?
Well, I mean, there will be one. There's a couple that people might go, "Oh, I'm surprised you didn't put them in." But and one of them is Alistair Taylor. But I couldn't really think of each of the ones I've put in has something slightly different to say. And if I could use one person to make points about others. So, for instance, if I could make points about other poets via Royston Ellis, because there's a lot of poets in the Beatles story, Roger McGough, Paul Muldoon, you know, if I could do that, I'd do that. And also, if I could, and I couldn't really with Alistair Taylor, who's a long-standing presence at Apple. but I couldn't really think of much to say about him that wouldn't be adequately covered in the pieces on Epstein and Derek Taylor and Mal and the other people close to the Beatles. So that might be one. The only one person I think that real Beatle nerds might say, "Oh, why didn't you put him in?" I think by and large, I'm happy. I'm happy with the 100. I don't feel so far. No one's come forward and said, "You left out such a body," and I've gone, "Oh my God, I can't believe I forgot them." So far, that's not happened, fortunately. But I could have found another 100, obviously.
We want the full Peter Jackson 58-hour cut from you, Stuart. We want at least another 500 in there.
Someone did say that. Why don't you do for the paperback like a Peter Jackson style redux and do another 50? We'll see. We'll see.
Alistair Taylor, though, that'd be a good shout, actually. He ended up running a tea room, didn't he?
He did. He's about the only one that I think I did and ah about whether to put him in or not. But I didn't want to drop any of the others I thought of. I had to drop others. And I did think I will be covering a lot of the same ground as Neil and Epstein and Derek Taylor in that chapter. So apologies. Well, he's no longer with us, is he? But,
By the way, without wanting to make any spoilers, nice touch putting Alan Klein at the arse end of the book, number 100. Was that a deliberate intention?
Well, it's deliberate in the sense that the book's roughly chronological, so that you meet the people as the Beatles met them. So starting with Ivan Vaughan, and there's a couple of pre-Beatle people, the families, the early friends. Then there's the people who were with them all the way through their career. And he just happens to be, of my 100 people, when he arrives, it's the end of the story, isn't it? I mean, he is the end of the story. He's the if you're a video gamer, he's the last big boss waiting at the end of the video game, or he's the monster at the back of the cave waiting. He's the dark force waiting at the end of the story. And, these two things clash and the Beatles lose, sadly. We all lose, I think. I mean, let's not be too harsh on Alan Klein. He was horrible to Paul, and his whole manner of being was antithetical to the spirit of the Beatles, I think. But maybe he just wanted to make the Beatles and him some money. I don't know. Ken Womack, the great Beatle historian, reckons he just wanted to screw the Beatles out of everything he could. I don't know. But certainly it spelt the end of the Beatles, him coming along. And so there's a certain melancholy, really. Well, he had to be there because he is the person who represents the full stop of the Beatles story, because within literally weeks of meeting him, the Beatles are no more.
I think you're being too kind to Klein, but we'll leave that one there.
I think I probably am. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question that no one has asked before. Instead of being an acclaimed BBC broadcaster and national treasure, would you have preferred to have been a hospital DJ on Radio Clatterbridge?
That's a very good question. No, I know why you're asking that, because that's the first ever Beatles interview, and there would be a certain cachet. The first radio interview, there would be some cachet in that. But I have been lucky enough to meet Paul McCartney 3 times. I think it's 3. So no. So I got to at least. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because I love the Beatles so much that I wanted at least have my bit of the Beatles story. So in years to come, when people are going down Beatles bibliographies, I've got a little contribution in there. So, I wanted to be part in some minor way of that extended story. So, yeah. And there is a biographer, and of course, Hunter Davies. So I wanted to give a nod to the various people who've written about the Beatles too. And I did that through the Hunter Davies chapter.
I could easily have read much more. Any plans for a volume 2? Or an expanded paperback version, as you mentioned?
Let's see. I mean, the trouble is now that we would be beginning to move. One, because I've done all the big stories in this one, it might be absolutely just for Beatles nerds, but we'll see. Are there enough Beatles nerds in the world to make it worthwhile me doing a volume 2? There certainly could be some kind of addenda to it, I guess, yeah, or something. I'll think.
Well, it's a highly enjoyable work. Definitely the most enjoyable Beatles book published in at least the last 2 weeks, if not ever. Stuart, thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it. And good luck with the book.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.